course, as you can see, we've got a full house in front of you right now. We've got a number of great guests who are going to be coming up throughout the show. So we are very, very, very happy to have you here with us once again on a Thursday night with our Breakthrough News team. And before we get into it, I'm Eugene Puryear, by the way, your host. Just want to remind people, especially if you're watching on YouTube, and if you aren't, maybe you should go to YouTube, youtube.com/Breakthrough News. Make sure you subscribe and make sure you also hit the bell. That means that you will, well, not just this, you will get many alerts about many of the things that we put out and all the great content. So subscribe on YouTube, hit the bell on YouTube, and not only will you get this, but you will get notifications about all of our fantastic content. I'm also joined as we continue here by my co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, welcome back.
Eugene, it's good to be back with you. Very excited about the show tonight. Great
Always
topic, great guests. Let's go.
Let's just get right into it.
Let's
go. I'm all for it. It's sort of like a Fast and Furious start. You know what I mean? That's how it is. Mm-hmm. Oh, I almost got to the Fast and Furious. Juan in the booth, also with us. What's up, Juan? How you feeling?
I'm feeling great. I'm feeling great to be outside. It's such nice weather outside. Like I've been able to bike, which I haven't been doing since like last summer. So I was like gasping yesterday, but you know,
that's all right.
One pedal at a time. I'm sorry.
Hey, look, you got to play yourself in shape. Got to play yourself in shape. I respect that. Ciara Taylor, popular educator, grassroots organizer, and artist. Welcome back to the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me. Juan, I thought vegans don't get cold. You shouldn't have had a problem biking in the winter.
Not cold. Oh no.
Vegans don't get cold.
We're already making just strong judgments. A minute and 30 seconds into the show.
Yeah, I am.
What's that?
Oh, wow. All right. A vegan who does CrossFit.
Oh, you didn't know that?
Haven't had any meat in like 13 years.
That's big. Well, don't eat any. You'd be very sick. But
why do vegans always have to tell you that?
Wow, this was just a lot of just shots fired from Ciara towards
I just missed one.
Breakthrough News doesn't endorse any of this.
I miss you too, Ciara.
I have a confession. I was a vegan for 8 years, and then I stopped being one. And I don't feel bad about it, but I respect you on.
I don't feel bad.
It's hard.
Well, I'm glad we could get a little respect in here as we start the show. I mean, we had Fast and Furious. We had people taking shots at people's lifestyle choices.
Yeah.
So let us turn to something that's actually serious before we get carried away here. And there will be many, many things, many guests. We're going to be talking about vaccine apartheid later on. But I wanted to start here, well, maybe juxtaposing a couple stories. And the first one being the murder of Andrew Brown Jr. in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. Now, for those who have not been paying close attention, this is a recent police murder in this small town, and there's a lot of controversy over what exactly happened, but it's unclear because the video has not been fully released. A very truncated version was shown to his family. There are allegedly many videos with many angles. There are accusations that certainly seem to be true, that there is something of an execution-style murder, so it's been very controversial. People have been protesting, but this is Elizabeth City, North Carolina, so I don't know if people have been paying as close attention. So quickly, we just want to show just a brief snippet from some of the protests there and some of how the police reacted.
It looks like we lost Ciara.
We may have lost Ciara. Hopefully we get her back.
We'll get her back.
You're back.
We got her.
There we go. We got to think positive.
Excellent. Well, you came back at the perfect time before we showed the clip. So this is just a little bit here from Elizabeth City, North Carolina.
No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace!
Say his name!
Andrew Brown!
Make some noise for Andrew!
This is the Elizabeth City Police Department. There is a curfew in effect at 8 p.m.
I'm gonna tell y'all don't want to do it, man.
Move back! Move back! Move back! They got hair on that. Move back!
That was last night in Elizabeth City, North Carolina, where protests are continuing over the murder of Andrew Brown. You know, Ciara, I wanted to get that last little bit in there. The D.C. police have started doing this too, this move back chant, which just is so dystopian to me. how does it, to me, Ciara, the thing that I think is so notable about this is obviously this is a terrible situation. All of these police murders are terrible. Coming in the wake so close to the execution of Derek Chauvin, you were on the show the night of the verdict in the Chauvin trial. I wonder how you're sitting with this Andrew Brown Jr. situation and what it all means.
Yeah, I can say watching that video of the law enforcement, in that sort of stormtrooper-esque fashion marching down the street really makes my stomach churn. Like, it makes me feel really sick. I think that what I am garnering from all of this is that the uprisings that happened over the last summer have, the 1% in just like a tiffy, like they're big mad and big scared.
Yeah.
And you really see the way in which I feel like they've responded through the organization of the law enforcement to move in that formation. It's clear that they've studied the uprisings and how they occur, how people organize themselves and bring themselves into the street. I'm thinking at this moment, how do we as organizers, how are we actually learning from these processes, these different uprisings that have occurred? How are we learning from the way that our communities have responded and organized? How do we learn about how the enemy is mobilizing right now so that we don't fall into the same pitfalls and traps as we have before, where all organization is just taken out and the police, the CIA, whomever, can come in and just cause havoc and chaos.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned the CIA, and I want to get some of your thoughts on the same thing, Rania, but before I do, I want to just preface it since they were mentioned. I mean, at the same time we're talking about this murder of another murder by police of a black man in America, you have the president last night talking about how we're going to wage war against white supremacy or whatever. Anyway, let's show that clip.
And we won't ignore what our intelligence agencies have determined to be the most lethal terrorist threat to the homeland today. White supremacy is terrorism. We're not going to ignore that either.
I mean, there are a lot of things that could be said there, Rania, including the mispronunciation of white supremacism, but nevertheless, or white supremacists, whichever one he was trying to say. But I mean, it just was such cognitive dissonance where he's like, well, I mean, the CIA is saying we got to go out here and tackle white supremacist terrorism, and yet here you are in Elizabeth City with another black man murdered by police. It's just unbelievable.
Yeah, I don't know how. Like, first of all, I just want to credit Joe Biden with apparently ending white supremacy, because everybody acted like him saying that. When I say everybody, I mean liberals who were really excited, and even some progressives acted like him just calling white supremacy terrorism is some big victory. It's just words. Yeah. It's more of these kinds of performative gestures. But let's look at what's happening across the country. You're increasing funding for police. Your police forces across the country continue to shoot and kill unarmed people. I mean, there were like with regularity, and then every single time communities protest these killings, there's this clampdown that just gets more and more brutal. The kinds of images that, if they were coming out of Russia or China or Venezuela, our own government would be saying, oh, that's a reason to intervene, how anti-democratic. Right. So, don't tell me that you consider white supremacy terrorism when this is ongoing. On top of that, I mean, if you look at the rest of that speech last night, not to take the focus so much away from police killings, but the rest of the speech, I mean, the guy mentioned China so many times. So in this speech where you're talking about white supremacy, you're still promoting these imperialist ideas that, are all about U.S. hegemony, dominating the world, continuing to have like all these military bases everywhere, escalate a Cold War that is hurting poor and brown and black countries. Not to mention, what we're going to be talking about as this conversation goes on, but the sort of vaccine inequality that's taking place with the U.S. leading it, where poor brown and black countries are not getting vaccines because of this horribly white supremacist structure that we have globally that Joe Biden is literally the head of right now. So I just can't take his comments seriously.
Yeah, Ciara, the thing that I really think about is the idea to sort of separate the state from white supremacy. The idea that, well, since the intelligence agencies have said that this is the biggest threat,
Right.
that now it must be, when historically you look at the FBI, well, obviously it's not the antithesis of white supremacy.
I mean, I just have to say, like, even looking at the video, Vice President Kamala Harris looked like she was like, oh, she looked like surprised. She was like, don't blink, don't blink, don't let them know. She was like, oh, white supremacy? That's what we're doing now? And it's just like, oh, God. White supremacy has become this word for, like, the boogeyman, like it's like this, almost like this new domestic war on terror and the way that they're using it and propagandizing it. And I was just talking to, some homies the other day about even the people who have been canceled because of tweeting. And I'm just like, okay, there's a difference between racism and, prejudice. There's a difference between white supremacy as a structural, systemic way that actually impacts our lives, like not having access to healthcare, not having access to voting rights, not people necessarily like other poor people saying racial slurs or insensitive comments. And what I'm noticing here is the Democratic Party, these sort of, corporate liberals are really painting this picture of us needing to go to war, not just with white supremacy. That's a code word now for Trumpism. Yeah. And so they want us to all go to war on Trump so that we forget that he was just a part of this system that has been screwing us over, so that the capitalists, the bankers, they can continue having an environment that is suitable for them to continue doing their dirt and making money.
Juan in the booth, agree or disagree?
No, I completely agree. I mean, I know that we're about to show this clip, but even when we're talking about war, like what is war when you're talking about like the U.S. spreading democracy, if not like just global white supremacy, right? Like how many countries all over the world do we have military bases controlling the resources of countries? How many like coups, how many government takeovers have there been? Like that is the fuel of white supremacy, right? And like you can't really remove that from the fabric of this country. It's not you can't reform white supremacy out of this country because it's very much the foundation. It's very much rooted in this system. So it's not surprising. It's in our history books. So if white supremacy is the problem, if that's the domestic terrorism, like what is radicalizing people if not the U.S. system itself, right? It's not like these online forums. That's where like these smaller groups like are created, but the amount of racism that there is in this country and the amount of racism that's been historically is not about the internet. Like it was racist long before the internet. There were laws that were passed. We had slave owner presidents, this country was rooted on the genocide of people and the enslavement of other people. And for that to be possible, you have to have racist roots. So if white supremacism or white supremacism is the issue, then like let's root it out. But that's gonna take an entire reconstruction of the system.
Well, I'm glad you brought the issue of the other clip, and I think as Rania was saying is so well, I mean, the competition between nations, and it was one other element of this is very bellicose, very nationalistic. So we wanted to play this one clip from President Biden that speaks to that.
We can't be so busy competing with one another that we forget the competition that we have with the rest of the world to win the 21st century. I also told President Xi that we'll maintain a strong military presence in the Indo-Pacific, just as we do with NATO and Europe, not to start a conflict, but to prevent one.
Well, Rania, I mean, I don't know what you think it means to win the 21st century, or what you think that NATO apparently is against war, not for war, which is why we need another one in Asia.
Well, I will say that one way to battle white supremacy is to ally with NATO, which was founded by former Nazis, to occupy the ocean around China. That's a really great way to tackle the white supremacist terrorism that Biden was talking about. I don't know what winning the 21st century means. I mean, it's just like a nonsense phrase. What I will say is I think it's really alarming how that rhetoric, that anti-China rhetoric, has become so normal among the Democratic Party, which gave him a standing ovation. It's not surprising, but it's alarming because that's what's going to be used to continue to justify the billions of more dollars that are going to be spent on the Pentagon budget, which Biden already has approved of. And I mean, I think moving forward, you know, he also in that speech he gave last night talked about how China is like, or he talked about Al Qaeda and ISIS and the drawdown in Afghanistan. And part of the drawdown in Afghanistan, while it's a good thing, has to do with wanting to divert resources away from that and towards this big, you know, escalation with China. So I really think that we need to start taking this new Cold War seriously, because this is what's going to be used to justify the U.S. presence around the world. This is what's going to be used to justify covert operations. This is going to be used to what's justify like ongoing coups and regime change attempts, and just the kind of destabilization campaigns that the U.S. embarks on everywhere is going to be this new Cold War with China. And it's going to, you know, I don't think the U.S. is prepared for the fact that China actually poses, unlike other adversaries, a real challenge in the sense that it is a growing power and it's not going anywhere. And at some point it is going to overtake the U.S.
Yeah, no, I think it's an important point on so many levels. I mean, above and beyond anything else, too, and just on the same theme of white supremacy. I mean, you think about I mean, in some ways we could call it the so-called Cold War. In the first Cold War, I mean, it was a hot war, but only for people in the global South. So, you know, Vietnam, right, Angola, Mozambique, Central America, Argentina, Chile, where else? Indonesia, we could go on and on and on, were ravaged in the context of what was happening, this so-called great power competition that was really being driven by the United States. And I mean, you know, yet again, and we've already seen it in the post 9/11 era, the impact of the U.S. foreign policy abroad of these great power games. Ciara isn't really neutral or just random, even though I know looking at it from America, sometimes it feels so far away, but it really is one of the most destructive forces, if not the most destructive force, along with perhaps climate change, of which the U.S. military is the largest polluter in the world today.
Yeah, I mean, so many thoughts. I mean, speaking of CIA, going back to
criminals in action, as Zach De La Rocha, the last emperor in KRS-One would say. That's a great song right there.
Yeah, the CIA. So I was listening to the rhetoric that he was using around China, this competition rhetoric. And I don't know if folks keep an eye on the Council on Foreign Relations, but they're basically a think tank, a foreign policy think tank made up of celebrities and Wall Street backers. And they say that they're nonpartisan. They say that, you know, all of that thing, but you know, their rhetoric or their analysis is really what supplies State Department political lines. And of course, I feel like we're hearing that with President Biden. And again, I feel like it's all connected, you know, all this money being pumped in on the domestic side to organizations fighting Trumpism is the same, you know, people who are doling out money around the world to combat China's growing competition. And you have to think, why is that? Like, why is China such a threat for the United States? And I was talking to Manu Karuka, who's a professor and he wrote Empire's Tracks. And he was saying that he would even call it a new opium war, and that the push for resources, the push around trade, and the particular focus and emphasis on China, and just thinking about how the U.S. is just always trying to be that police of everywhere, whether it's here in the United States being this moral authority or this hard baton in the streets, or around the world, again, trying to be this moral authority, but also, again, being the strong fist that keeps the natives in order, you know.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. I mean, I always say the euphemisms they use, when you read things like the National Defense Strategy and other pieces like that, like the rules-based international order. Well, who makes the rules? I mean, to know whether or not it's good to enforce the rules-based international order. I mean, not only do I want to know what the rules are, and they're certainly bad, but who even established them? And it's sort of like the U.S. makes the rules, says everyone must abide by the rules, and then sets up a moral standard using all these euphemistic phrases, Rania, around, enforcing the rules that somehow make it seem like they're doing a service to the world.
Well, it's like international law. I mean, if we want to talk about the rules-based order, the entire international law system is literally written to benefit countries like America, the entire ways, and it only applies to bad countries in the global South. Like, these rules are never applied. It doesn't matter if America breaks them. America can break whatever trade policies. It can break whatever policy. It can break humanitarian law whenever it feels like it. It's never held accountable. As far as I've seen, like, the only people who've ever been tried at The Hague have been leaders of brown and black countries, and maybe like one Slavic leader. Apparently, white European countries, or their successors in places like America, Canada, and Australia, apparently they don't commit war crimes.
White supremacism.
So the entire Right, white supremacism. No, the entire rule-based order is such a complete joke. It's a complete joke. It's obviously written by the powerful to subjugate the weak. And that's why, I mean, it's really hard. As someone who lives in the Middle East, I can't really take it seriously because it's even more stark in the Middle East. I mean, America's allies, like Saudi Arabia, and Israel can commit whatever crimes they want. They're never held accountable. They can commit a genocide against Yemen. They can carpet bomb Gaza. They can starve Palestinians. But then, when America's adversaries like sneeze, it's like a really big deal, and it must be taken very seriously and sanctioned. It's a joke.
The country must be destroyed if it refuses to comply. I mean, that's what it really comes down to, is if you comply, do whatever you want to do. So essentially, if you're a leader around the world and you just want to loot the wealth of your own people, you're going to be good to go. But if you want to actually do something to help someone, then you're almost certainly going to put yourself in a position whereby you will be targeted by the United States. I mean, the lack of moral equivalency here is unbelievable. I mean, the hypocritical nature of how democracy and human rights is used as rhetoric.
I mean, just look at Iran and Israel. Israel has nuclear weapons, and its leaders regularly, on a daily basis, threaten to wipe out a country, whether it's Lebanon or Iran. Well, we're going to wipe Iran off the map. And then like one fringe Iranian person on like some, wacko radio station says something crazy, and it's like headline news in America. Like, it represents the views of the Iranian government because they'll be like, we're going to take out Israel. Like, it's just the double standards are overwhelming and everywhere. Yeah. Palestinian throws a rock at an Israeli tank, and the question is, that poor Israeli tank. I hope it made it through okay.
I was reading about the East Jerusalem protests, and just like the way it's written in the mainstream media, as if like there were two sides to this story. You have a rampaging mob of racists trying to, have a pogrom against Arab people, and then people say, well, hey, maybe we should, defend ourselves in the context of this pogrom. And then the Israeli cops show up, arrest a bunch of Palestinians, and somehow the stories in the Western media the next day are like, wow, those Palestinians were just totally out of control. I mean, it's an unbelievable state of affairs.
They provoked the Israeli genocidal mobs.
There's good people on both sides.
But Ciara, I have to say, to make a connection here on this issue, you can say whatever you want to say, regardless of what I'm about to say. But it is like lynchings and things like that. It was always something that black people did. That was the reason why these massive things were happening. And I think the same thing can be said about pogroms in the former Tsarist Empire, is that these people are causing trouble. They're bringing it on themselves. And obviously in the context of Israel, people don't want to say it, but to me, it feels like you're in the exact same playbook.
And and again, it's just like the U.S. wants to continue to do their dirt without looking like they're dirty, and China exposes the filth of the United States. And it's not just. I feel like this question around China is so important because it's not just like white supremacisms, or like colored people versus like this is a political project that has been able to sustain itself, that has been developed by poor people for their own interests. And it's not just about a series of policies and legislations or, getting new people into office, but it's a real rehumanization process that they had to go through in terms of like being able to shift the culture to turn away from the violence of poverty and all that comes with it, with that mindset under oppressive systems. And I think that all of that, like, that is the real threat. And so I'm thinking about, in this day and time, it's just like, how are we building the leaders who are able to bring us to the next stage of our political project and not get mired down in the muck and the propaganda and the the illusion of who our enemy is under the analysis of those who would have us, die and starve as long as they're making money. So,
no, please go ahead, Juan.
Nah, I feel like when a year after the uprising, an uprising against police brutality, an uprising really against the state. Like at this point, like we need to understand that we can't let our oppressor let us know, like tell us who our enemy is, right? Like if the state is killing us, right? If the state is riddled with white supremacy or white supremacyisms, then like why believe that China's the enemy? Why believe anything that like we're told? The thing is that I'm always baffled by is like the amount of people that are anti-government, but like we'll take this rhetoric, we'll take this anti-China rhetoric, we'll take like this like racist rhetoric on a regular basis, because it doesn't matter how anti-government you are. It ends up being like the lack of participation or the lack of organization, but you still are taking in that like political education from the state, right? In fact, they want us to be anti-government. They want us to not participate. They want us not to organize. They want us to be cynical because then the state can continue working, right? Because when the cynicism is lack of action, then that's perfect for the state. But if our cynicism is organizing, our cynicism is fighting the state, then it's something that is feared.
Yeah. Well, so much that could be said on all of this. And as always, Ciara, I really appreciate you joining the show. You're starting to become a regular guest. I feel great about that. I hope you'd be willing to come back yet again. Popular educator, grassroots organizer, artist, Ciara Taylor, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you. I always feel like the guest who comes over to the party early to get you all just like a little tipsy, and then
you just spiked the punch and bounced.
As soon as I get lit, I'm like, all right, I gotta go.
Respect. Someone's got to do that. Thank you so much, Ciara. I appreciate it. We're gonna keep moving on. I don't know. We have not been drinking, just to clarify. It's a family show. But
we should start making that a regular part of the show, right? Everybody just spikes the punch.
Drinking.
Yeah, everyone just spikes and see where it goes.
Well, it worked for Mad Men. People like that when there's all sorts of drinking going on. I don't know if it worked for people in real life.
You gotta have a cigar. Eugene's gotta have you gotta have a cigar, Eugene.
I don't support cigarettes, so I don't want to say that. But it is interesting when you watch old TV shows how people will just be smoking on TV. I was watching some clip from Mike Wallace, and he goes to another guest, and the guest who was just talking just like reaches in his pocket, pulls out a pack of cigarettes, just lights a cigarette. I was just like, man, times.
It's got to be product placement.
What's that?
It's got to be product placement. It's got to be.
No, I think people were just addicted to cigarettes since they didn't know that they were bad.
That too. Torches of liberation, as they called them back in the day.
My dad started smoking in 1948.
Long story. We'll have to have an episode just about marketing cigarettes.
Well, I'll tell you one more. My dad started smoking in 1948, and I asked him once what they would tell you about cigarettes, and he was like, oh, they would actually tell them that they're good for you, and that when you've been smoking for a really long time and we're coughing, you were just getting all the bad stuff out of your lungs, so it was okay. I mean, corporations, they'll go to great lengths. But we want to turn here to the issue that is obviously, I think, just hanging over every single person in the world, COVID-19, the progress of vaccines, the issue of vaccine apartheid. And we are very, very honored to be joined as we continue the show by Kambale Musavuli, who is an activist, a writer, and an analyst with the Center for Research on the Congo, Kinshasa. Kambale, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, thank you. I'm glad to see everyone safe. And I'm looking forward to seeing all of us in person.
Yes, absolutely. I am very much looking to that when we can travel again and exchange. You know, Kambale, this phrase vaccine apartheid it's become a big phrase now. A lot of people are talking about it, and there's many ways to look at it and talk about it, but it feels so appropriate to me first and foremost because it feels as if Africa, more so than, especially sub-Saharan Africa, almost more so than anywhere else in the world, is getting the short end of the stick as it concerns the vaccination issue.
Indeed. I mean, there are a few contradictions on the African continent. One, COVID-19 took everybody by surprise, especially on the African continent. We have a challenge on the African continent where the perception of COVID is that it's not real. Is quite present with people. I mean, there is a history of that. I may make the comparison. If you talk to descendants of the Tuskegees and you ask them about any vaccine today, would they want to take vaccine? Now, there is a reason why people are worried about vaccine because of the different syphilis vaccine tests that the U.S. has done on people and so on. On the African continent, if you look at the DRC, research has shown that for HIV, some of the infection of HIV came from polio vaccine. So there is this disinformation about what Africa needs. So as we were first taken by shock by COVID, it wasn't the poor who brought COVID on the African continent. I mean, somebody had to get on the plane, very privileged to get in on the African continent. And as it arrived, many countries on the African continent did not have the pharmaceutical facilities or medical facilities to be able to care for the COVID uprising within the country. So in DRC, for example, we didn't have more than 100 ventilators in the entire country. We're a country of 81 million people, right?
Wow.
Then you have the religious right. The religious right in the United States is quite connected on the African continent. I mean, I cry here, and I can tell you that at 5 a.m., many of the TV stations here will start playing not Ghanaian pastors, they will start playing American pastors, and some of them from Texas, right? On the regular basis. As when you watch now the content that's being put, you hear the same conspiracy theories that you hear in the United States. The mark of the 666, if you get the vaccine, you should not take it, and so on. But the ordinary individual who's going about his life or life trying to change the conditions of their people may not understand all the dynamic, right? So most people are not inclined to take the vaccine. Let's use the case of the Congo. This is a news that came out 2 days ago. The DRC received for the COVAX project of providing the AstraZeneca in African countries. They received 1.7 million vaccine. We are a country of 81 million people. 2 days ago, it is announced that UNICEF is going to take 1.3 million of those vaccines away from the DRC to avoid expiration. Can you imagine that we actually receive? People are not taking, the government does not have the capacity to distribute it. And plus, there is no education on why it's important. So that's one level to first understand the context of how people are perceiving vaccine, if it's necessary or not. We know that from the West, at least what I've been sharing with people on the ground is, the West is not interested in pushing vaccine on African people. They are actually holding on to themselves, right? They don't want to release the intellectual property, the Pfizer and Moderna. They want to keep it to themselves. So there is no push to force Africans to take it. But there is this misinformation going on across the African continent around that. But the second part, which I find hopeful, while we may not have access to the vaccine and so on, Africans have understood, in some other countries, have figured out a way to deal with the COVID situation. So I can give you an example. In February of last year, when the COVID hits, you remember there was this whole discussion around you need to have this N95 mask.
Right.
People have to wear N95 masks. Countries have been shut down. How will an African get an N95 mask? It was nowhere to be found. But in February already of 2020, Africans were making the masks. There were masks here in Ghana that was being provided by communities where before even the WHO said that you could use different fabric with, I think, 2 to 3 layers to protect yourself. People were already doing that. That's one aspect that I found the ingenuity of the people to address their own issues. The other, there have been people who have worked on using traditional medicine to help themselves. What is the context of that, right? You don't have access to vaccine. There are not adequate medical facilities. We understand what the virus is. We know that we need to boost our immune system. We have to clean our hands and so on. So people have already started using boosters, vitamin C boosters that they will use for themselves. Have there been enough studies to prove that this has worked against COVID? Not enough, right? But people on the ground have used traditional herbal medicine to treat themselves. And for some reasons, and that's what all the scientists are asking themselves, with the lack of medical facilities, lack of access to vaccine, and the West literally blocking the intellectual property so that Africans can produce the vaccine locally, we don't have the same level of deaths that we see in other parts of the world. South Africa was hit the most. I do believe people are dying. I mean, in Ghana, we've seen it. People in our circles, their family members have lost their lives, unfortunately, with COVID. So we know it's real. We know government officials have gotten it. Just a side note, one of the young activists that we work with here in Ghana, she's a nurse. She shared with us during one of the trainings we were doing how it's quite fascinating that some of the pastors who have been preaching to their members about not taking the vaccine or praying their way, she saw them taking the vaccine when he arrived in Ghana. In her hospital, right? So, but yet they're preaching. So she shared this type of context. But then it's still challenging for the African continent. I'll end by adding the situation also of the vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, particularly what's happening in Ghana. They received the first batch of the AstraZeneca. All of them were used, right? People have been vaccinated. It wasn't enough. I think it wasn't over even 1 million they arrived, but it's all gone. The second dose for most people is this month. There is no second dose here. Why? The manufacturer company does not have it, which is the Indian institute that's been producing in mass the AstraZeneca, and the vaccines that they have produced are being hugged by Western countries. So people have gotten the first dose, but the second dose is not here. Right? So you're finding out all these issues. And the leaders that we work with here in Ghana are clearly stating that the solution beyond the vaccine that we are receiving is for Africans to develop their health capacity, their health infrastructure. This is an opportunity for Africans to do so. But unfortunately, the African leaders are not thinking that way. They're not thinking that this is the appropriate time to now start building a vaccine center here, start building pharmaceutical centers, encouraging local doctors, just like in Nigeria, they've started tests on the vaccine that they are trying. If Cuba can do it, what can't African countries do?
Yeah. No, I think that's a great point. I mean, Cuba is a country of 11 million people, going to produce 100 million at least of various vaccines. I mean, Rania, it really just reminds me of, in so many ways, it's sort of the impact of imperialism over time and in multiple levels. I mean, you've got, the historical impact, the underdevelopment of nations, and the contemporary impact of the vaccine apartheid that we're seeing.
Yeah, and I want to just point out, high-income countries have purchased more than half of the COVID-19 vaccine supply to date. Low-income countries, just 9%. That's according to Duke University's Global Health Innovation Center. So you have this huge disparity in how many vaccines these different parts of the world have, where you have countries like the US, I think that we have at least twice enough vaccines, or enough vaccines to inoculate the population twice over. For Canada, it's like 5 times the number of vaccines they need. So you have actual hoarding taking place. Rich countries had pre-purchased something like 96% of the doses of Pfizer, for example. 100% of Moderna supply was also purchased by rich nations. I mean, this is hoarding on an epic scale, and it really does highlight not just global inequality, but just the level of the fact that this is happening off of these big pharmaceutical companies. Because these big pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and Moderna, they're located in the global north. And so you have a situation where these pharmaceutical companies are actually using the governments in which they sit to prevent their vaccines from being more readily available and being made cheaply by preventing the waiving of these patent rights, right? You've got poor countries like Brazil and India and like 100 other countries begging the global north to please force their pharmaceutical companies to waive the patent rights to their vaccines so they can be made cheaply, as Kambale was saying. And the response so far since December has been no from the US, no from the UK, no from the EU. So it really is this in your face, rich countries that are only rich because they stole resources and enslaved people. They literally stole labor and resources from the global south. That's the only reason they're rich and developed, are preventing the pandemic from ending in poor countries. And as a result, we could end up with some new crazy variant that's vaccine resistant, which will be great for Pfizer and Moderna because then they can produce new vaccines that then have to be purchased by governments. And also, I just want to point out that these vaccines were made using money to fund research from the public. Huge amounts of money.
Yeah, I want to bring Juan back in here on a couple of these, talking about the global north, rich people, and the callousness that is out there. Juan and I were chatting about a clip we saw earlier on exactly that note.
Yeah, no, it's actually insane. I want to show the clip and then we could talk about it a little bit.
Please.
So this is an interview with Bill Gates, and they were talking about exactly that, about the patents. And he was literally asked, does he think the patents should be removed so the vaccine can be produced just all over the world and bring the price down? Oh, give me 1 second.
Yeah, we'll get Bill Gates' answer here. I mean, who even made Bill Gates the person who decides that? I mean, the fact that the individual social power of Bill Gates as a capitalist and the philanthropy that he does on global health. I mean, as far as I know, the man has no public health credentials at all. But yet and still,
Bill Gates did.
Here we go.
It's the same thing. It's the same thing with Elon Musk. Elon Musk is now an astronaut, right? Like the rich can do whatever the hell they want. They can do whatever they want.
It's because of what they invest in. It's because Bill Gates has invested huge sums of money in these different pharmaceutical companies that make these vaccines. We know he's been profiting off of jacking up the prices of vaccines that go to Africa. He's been doing this for decades.
Yeah, I want to toss to the
so
clip.
it's not surprising. Yeah.
There's been some speculation that the changing intellectual property rules and allowing these vaccines, as you say, the recipe for these vaccines to be shared would be helpful. And do you think that would be helpful?
No.
Why not?
Well, there's only so many vaccine factories in the world. And
wait, I just want to pause it. Real quick. That certainty, right?
No.
people are very serious about the safety of vaccines. And so moving something that had never been done, moving a vaccine from, say, a J&J factory into a factory in India, that it's novel. It's only because of our grants and our expertise that can happen at all. The thing that's holding things back in this case is not intellectual property. There's not like some idle vaccine factory with regulatory approval that makes magically safe vaccines.
Yes, there is.
Not true. There's multiple.
You got to do the trials on these things, and every manufacturing process has to be looked at in a very careful way. There's all sorts of issues around intellectual property having to do with medicines, but not in terms of how quickly we've been able to ramp up the volume here.
He's a liar.
I mean, there's the level of duplicity there, and so many of the things that were said is unbelievable, Kambale. I mean, the first thing that jumps out at me is that he used India as an example. India is literally the world's largest producer of vaccines, and as we know from our friends in NewsClick, there actually is a giant pharmaceutical factory sitting unused and empty in the southern part of the country. But anything you want to comment regarding Bill Gates is certainly welcome here, Kambale. But just that element of it to me was so unbelievable in terms of just the racism and disrespect towards the global South.
Yeah.
I mean, India does not have the vaccine because they can't use the vaccine that they are producing for the global North. I mean, that's one of the reasons why India is pushing. I mean, I don't think people realize that they're being vaccinated by vaccine manufacturing in India. Because they made vaccines for Canada, they made vaccines for Europe and so on. They have the capacity to do it. I mean, you asked me a very difficult question, right? It's not even a question. You made a statement that I should comment on Bill Gates. Bill Gates is representing something so insidious that we shouldn't look at him as an individual. There are other people like him. We're mentioning, we can talk about the other Bill, the political Bill Clinton, right? That the people who have the wealth and the power are dictating what should people believe, and people don't have access to the information because they provide platform for them. You will see him on TV. He will sound with this great English that they would pass at school to speak. And he sounds as a reasonable person. But how can he stand in front of a camera and lie? And there is no repercussion, right? Tomorrow there will not be someone to hold him accountable for lying that India does not have the capacity to provide vaccine or other part of the world. The issue is not the production of vaccine. The issue is that the intellectual property of the vaccine is not provided to the people. And that goes even to the business that he created. He extracted so much surplus value from the knowledge of developers over decades. This guy was not writing code. He was not assembling computers, right? But he has all this wealth from the people. The same thing can be said about Jeff Bezos.
Yeah.
We just, about a couple of weeks ago, we were watching a documentary done by Al Jazeera about the Amazon factory. And when people in Ghana saw that Amazon workers have a timer to go to the bathroom, that if you do not go back, you will lose your job. People could not believe it. And whenever they say to them, in the documentary, so that they say that if Jeff Bezos today give every one of his employees $200,000 bonus, he will still have the same wealth that he had when COVID started. People were blown away, right? So for us, the working class of the world, we have to now understand it's no longer a question of what he has to do. That's why I brought up the ingenuity of the Africans. We didn't wait for WHO to say, now you can wear any mask. All right, it was like, wear the N95 mask. No, we are not going to wait for the N95 masks, right? They're talking about the confinement measures. In some countries, it's impossible, right? Kinshasa alone, the capital city, Kinshasa has 15 million people. You have a choice of being confined or dying of starvation. So you have to move. So people start thinking about ingenious ways of how do we live with this reality where this disease of the rich in the continent of Africa, this is how it's seen. COVID only entered the African continent because of the bourgeoisie and those who have the privilege of traveling to come into the country. That's the only way it got into some of the remote areas in the country. Yeah. So that's how it's being presented to the people. But I'm sorry, but it's really hard to speak frankly on live television about Bill Gates. But I think he should stop speaking, and we should give the platform more to the people who are facing COVID on the ground, who can say this is what's happening to us, and this is how we should regain control. It should not be illegal to have the IP. Who is the WikiLeaks of Pfizer and Moderna? We need these codes. Release it to the masses. Mm-hmm. Be the person who's going to say that this is the day this will end. It's for humanity.
Absolutely. You know, well, I was just going to say, if you are that person, Breakthrough News will release that, and we're not afraid, whatever the consequences are. I mean, the stakes are so high. Rania, go ahead.
I just want to say, I think that given what you're saying, Bill Gates is speaking, like you said, not as an individual. He's speaking on behalf of the capitalist class. He's speaking on behalf of the pharmaceutical industry when he says those lies. And I think this has more to do with than just COVID. Right? It's that they don't want to establish a precedent. Because once they make for one vaccine, the intellectual property available, once they waive those patent rights, it's almost like maybe they probably fear there's no going back, right? Because if you do it for this one thing, then people might start asking, well, why can't you do it for other vaccines? Why can't you do it for other medical procedures? Why can't we just stop prioritizing profits over people? It might lead down this slippery slope of really questioning this absurd, unequal global order that we have that denies not just COVID vaccines to people, denies HIV treatments to people, right?
Malaria.
Denies vaccines malaria vaccines to people. There already is this, it's not just with the COVID vaccine, there already is this entire system of unequal vaccine prices around the world where for just childhood vaccines, there's been studies done on this where, across Africa and Latin America, poorer countries are actually paying higher prices for childhood vaccines than global north countries like France are paying. So there's already inequality embedded in this vaccine system that someone like Bill Gates is deeply invested in. So I think this is also about protecting that extremely unjust and unequal order, right? Because once you set one precedent, it's like, well, why can't everything just be that way?
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. Well, Kambale, I really appreciate you being willing to join us. I know it is a lot later over there where you are in Accra, so thank you so much for giving us some of your time. It was so great to have you here. Very honored.
Thank you, and see you very soon.
Yes, absolutely. Looking forward to it. Well, we're going to move forward here. It is not over yet. We've actually got two fantastic guests joining us to continue the conversation. We've got Mikaela Erskog, who's an educator, researcher with Pan-Africanism Today, and also the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. And we also have back with us today Dr. Gerald Horne, who is the Morris Professor of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston, among many other things. Mika and Gerald, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
I can definitely hear you all right, Mika, and I know it's also very late where you are, so thanks again for joining us. I want to ask you a question here, Mika, that I just have been, I don't know if it is a paradox. I don't know how to view it, but I've been thinking about it a lot over the past couple days. Looking at the TRIPS waiver issue in front of the World Trade Organization, on the one hand, obviously South Africa and India are leading a valiant struggle to lift the intellectual property protections. But I did sort of glance briefly at some of the conversation around Freedom Day that celebrates the first free election in 1994 in South Africa. And from a lot of the unions and other social organizations, there were some pretty potent criticisms of not only how the government had dealt with COVID-19, but many other things. And it just felt like such a paradox that on the one hand, it's like, yes, the South African government is fighting in the WTO for the right thing. But then you look, it seems to not really be covering itself in glory on the home front. I just didn't know what to make of that.
Well, thanks, Eugene and Rania, and hi to Professor Gerald Horne. I'm really glad to be participating in this very important discussion. So there are a couple of things which I think are worth saying before we delve into some of the deep and miserable contradictions that the South African people and the African people are having to deal with, is that, number one, many of us on the left and trade unions, social movements, on the one hand, we do welcome the push by South Africa and India for this waiver of intellectual property rights, which would make significant strides in terms of vaccine production for countries that are largely relying on the COVAX, which we know is pretty much, inefficient and is not going to actually solve the issue. We welcome it on the one hand, but on the other hand, in the same way that we will be, criticizing Cyril Ramaphosa and the ruling party for the kind of continued decades of neoliberal policies that have totally impoverished and deprived the working class and the majority in South Africa, we can criticize them on the one hand about that, but simultaneously welcome the fact that, for example, Ramaphosa endorsed Cuba's Henry Reeve Medical Brigade to get the Nobel Peace Prize, which is an extremely important internationalist advocacy move, because they've done incredible work and shown what solidarity means in a moment in which, as Rania was saying, the US, the global north have been closing in on themselves, have been hoarding vaccines, have been, refusing to share knowledge, tech, productive capacities that essentially we as the working class of the world have generated and produced over decades, over centuries, right? So on the one hand, we very much support this waiver, which, for those who don't know, it's just in this particular situation. Many of us would want intellectual property rights to be waived across the board for all the kinds of things that humankind needs. This is in a situation in which Moderna, one of the big vaccine producers, is expected to make 18 billion this year in 2021, which is supposed to be the first time they're making profit in 11 years, right? Since their founding, they've not made profit. And now they're going to make an estimated at least 18 billion this year. So on the one hand, we very much welcome this, and even a lot of us on the far left even push back against, I'm sure you guys have heard of Okonjo-Iweala, who's the new Director General of the World Trade Organization, the first African woman who's leading the charge, who even some of us, are pushing back against her kind of third way, where, she essentially wanted a middle ground of let's allow groups to actually volunteer their kind of licenses, that's the word, not legalities, licenses for manufacturing. And we completely disagree. We believe there has to be a full waiver of all intellectual property rights that will enable people of the world to be vaccinated, because we know that if we're not vaccinated everywhere, it's going to be a huge problem. And we've seen this in South Africa with the variants, the 501Y-V2, which as soon as we allow for variants of the strain to be developed, we are creating even greater issues, because we saw with AstraZeneca, we tried to buy a bunch of AstraZeneca early in the year and found that it's not very effective against the vaccine. And this, by the way, we were paying more than double of what a lot of European countries were paying for AstraZeneca. I think South Africa purchased it per dose. It was around $5-point-something, whilst I think Europeans paid around $2. And part of their reasoning, they said, was that it was due to the fact that these European countries had contributed to the research and development, right? And this ignores the fact that, yes, this pre-purchasing. And in terms of research and development, this is the ironic thing. So many global South nations contribute to the research and development, as well as public institutions and, public funding across the global north. But as soon as it's about accessing it, all of a sudden the privatization clause comes up, right? Whilst in South Africa, they did do a trial of around 2,000 health workers who did contribute to AstraZeneca getting some kind of, knowledge about the vaccine. So that's my long run to say that on the one hand, we will push for the waiver, as much as we can. But of course, most of us, like the Indians, know how difficult it is to live in these extremely like neoliberal, profiteering countries that, what is it? How does Biden call white supremacy, you said?
White supremacism is white supremacyism, I think he said.
We also have our own fair share of white supremacism in South Africa, where we have about like 3 white men who have more collective wealth than a lot of the like bottom half of the country. And in South Africa, we have an extremely, as many of you know, an extremely unequal society where if we just look at health, 84% of the population, they use public health, right? But this actually, I think it's 60% of health professionals are actually in the private sector. And the private sector only serves 16% of the population. So we have an extremely unequal society where Ramaphosa, the South African government, have done very little and have really bungled things up, honestly speaking, in the last year since we discovered the virus. That even if we take a very liberal perspective, there are so many small things around patent laws within the country that are insufficient, the fact that we actually don't have a lot of the production capacity, the fact that if it comes to distribution, I mean, South Africa was aiming at the beginning of the year, they want to vaccinate 67% of their population, which would require them to do 150,000 vaccinations a day. 150,000. And I think the US is just barely touching on, 50,000 a day. It requires a massive infrastructure that the South African neoliberal government has for decades basically been gutting and plundering.
Yeah. I want to bring up a quick visualization here, speaking to this TRIPS waiver, about who supports it and who is against it to raise my next issue here. I mean, many people could probably expect it. So this is a map. I'm sorry, the large TV I have just to my right, so sorry, I'm looking to the right. The red are people who are against waiving intellectual property for the COVID-19 vaccine. The green is a co-sponsor, and the lighter green is supporters. The yellow is undecided. I have to say, Dr. Horne, when I look at a graph or look at a map like this, I mean, it's Europe, the US, Canada, Australia, Japan, Brazil. I mean, there's so many things that could be said about this, but just the fact that, Joe Biden had this huge speech about the moral supremacy of the United States last night, and here we are with the fate of the world, in his hands to some degree over this WTO issue, and this is the real state of the moral, some might say authority degeneracy of the U.S., it seems.
Well, I think that speech last night by Mr. Biden was quite revealing, although not necessarily intentionally. What I mean is that the country that was mentioned repeatedly during the course of his lengthy remarks was the People's Republic of China, and to a certain extent, Russia. And so when we talk about Big Pharma, when we talk about Moderna and Pfizer in particular, they have competition. You have a Sputnik V in Russia. You have a Chinese vaccine as well. The Cubans are on the verge of presenting their vaccine similarly. And so when Washington and its allies take this muddle-headed position with regard to intellectual property, with regard to hoarding the vaccines, in some ways, all they're doing is providing a kind of advantage to those countries that they now say are in the crosshairs, as the United States is in the midst of a new Cold War. Recall that during the previous Cold War, there was such pressure on the United States of America that it felt compelled, in order to preserve its fading image, to retreat from the more egregious aspects of U.S. apartheid, meaning Jim Crow. And there's going to be a similar dynamic operating today, it seems to me, ultimately, with regard to this vaccine. If you look at India, for example, where you have this catastrophe, this fiasco, not least because of the policies of Prime Minister Modi, a close ally of Washington, you have not only Russia, a close New Delhi ally, ferrying in various kinds of vaccines and medical supplies, but the People's Republic of China as well, not to mention the fact that it's not just India that is being afflicted so grievously. inevitably you see neighbors like Nepal and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka being affected as well. And likewise, you will see Moscow and Beijing seeking to come to the assistance of these particular countries, which obviously will not necessarily be consistent or congruent with this new Cold War. I should also say that Washington has just summoned home many of its personnel and diplomats from New Delhi. Now, who is to say that they are not bringing the virus with them? Who is to say what variant of the virus they may be bringing with them? And so in some ways, this policy with regard to hoarding the vaccine, with regard to keeping a tight control on intellectual property rights, is rather self-defeating in terms of the overall strategy of U.S. imperialism.
That's an interesting point. Go ahead, Rania.
Well, I was going to say, what's incredible about what you're saying, Gerald, is on top of, giving its adversaries this space to do vaccine diplomacy, on top of refusing to waive intellectual property rights and make its own vaccines more widely available to produce, the U.S. was also pressuring Latin American governments not to buy the Russian vaccine. In fact, we know there was this report that came out from the Department of Health and Human Services, their annual report for 2020 that Brazil Wire had reported on, where they actually brag that they pressured Brazil to reject the Russian COVID-19 vaccine as a part of their strategy to mitigate efforts by states like Cuba, Venezuela, and Russia to increase their malign influence in the region. So at the same time as the U.S., this is what's it brings it to like a new, really almost, sadistic level where you're not only denying access to vaccines to poorer countries, in the case of Brazil, a country that's had a massive outbreak, right? You're also using your sway over their right-wing government to deny them access to a vaccine from Russia that they can actually access. It's just, it's unbelievable to me. Maybe it shouldn't be, but what do you think about that?
Well, I understand why you're quizzing this particular policy, and certainly with regard to Brazil, President Bolsonaro is now under investigation by the parliament in Brasilia. It's the equivalent of an impeachment hearing. It could lead possibly even to his indictment, which makes it even more remarkable that on that revealing graphic that you just displayed, that Brazil has a position similar to that of the United States of America. Now, you would think that given the horrible record with regard to containing the virus that President Bolsonaro has presided over, that he would be joining with his comrades within the BRICS, particularly South Africa and India, to try to loosen intellectual property restrictions. But yet his policies are as contradictory as those of his patrons in Washington, D.C. And I think that we can never mention enough the point you mentioned a few moments ago, which is that after all, at the end of the day, with regard to Big Pharma in the United States, that a considerable portion of their research is funded by we, the taxpayers. So we fund their research. They produce these pharmaceuticals. They charge us an arm and a leg, generally speaking, in order to access these pharmaceuticals. And then the chief executive officers and the board make out like bandits. Obviously, this is a system that is dysfunctional, but worse than that, it is a system that now is accelerating a pattern of death that is unconscionable.
Mm-hmm. Mika, one of the things that's notable, and I'm curious your thoughts about, I think the point that Dr. Horne brought up, which is this issue of the impact on U.S. imperialism of just how it looks, what has been happening with COVID-19, what they're doing. I also wonder, Mika, the potential impact, or your thoughts about the potential impact about sort of the ideological struggle between capitalism and socialism, because, there are capitalist countries that did a much better job than the United States and Brazil. I'll say that for sure. But, it's very notable to me, China, Vietnam, the state of Kerala and India, we could look. But, even Venezuela, I was talking to some of our Breakthrough News team. Anyone who knows me, I'm a longtime supporter of the Bolivarian Revolution. I went looking to see how many people had died in Venezuela. I myself was shocked how few it was. It's about 2,000. It's fewer than Israel, fewer than Switzerland. The most overall wealth of any country per capita, and they have thousands and thousands more. I mean, it just seems like such a powerful and important statement on so level. The way that Vietnam mobilized the whole country to save that British pilot who wasn't even a citizen. I mean, it does seem that this, maybe I'm being too Pollyannish, has to have some effect on people's consciousness and sort of the black hat, white hat narrative about social systems.
So, I mean, it's actually interesting you raised that, because I was reading about, I'm not sure if you guys are aware, but Blinken recently had virtual meetings with different heads of African states. And he doesn't put on the table any kind of like, what are the collaborations we should be doing around, COVID vaccines? What are the ways in which we can provide relief for the African continent? He immediately is trying to opportunistically push back against China. He uses the space to say, well, we can offer a more lucrative, beneficial alternative. And this is China, who in the last decade has been providing really essential infrastructural support and construction in Africa. This is the same continent that for 500 years under capitalism, barely any infrastructure, barely like 3 hospitals are built in Guinea-Bissau, during the whole of Portuguese colonial rule. And so he uses opportunistically this let's push back, and he barely knows anything about the African continent when he speaks to people, let alone offering concrete alternatives. And interestingly, the Foreign Ministry of China on Wednesday, which, has been getting a lot of slack for what do they call them?
The wolf warrior diplomacy.
Wolf warrior, in terms of being more vocal. But in fact, what they do on Wednesday is they say, we invite US concrete cooperation with the African continent. We invite any forms in which you can also help us to improve the lives of African people, rather than, trying to create this exclusivity as being a more attractive or, a better option, which is essentially what the US did. And this is the same US that, let's not forget, continues to have the biggest, foreign military presence on the continent, continues to use, the kind of religious extremism to basically ramp up its presence in different parts of West Africa and the Sahel, that continues to support, the French foreign military presence in places like Niger, where there's very key mineral resources and energy resources in terms of uranium. So I think when we are thinking about this kind of war of ideologies, if we even take it a step back and say, we're not saying capitalism versus socialism, let's even say basic multilateral relationships and bilateral relationships that are improving the concrete lives of people. China offers a better alternative. It's as simple as that. They do it on our terms. They do it with concrete material things that benefit us and that we can see with our eyes, unlike the decades of structural adjustment programs and the fact that all the conditionalities that come with those programs have completely underdeveloped the continent.
Dr. Horne, I'm curious your thoughts on the same question.
Well, I'm happy to hear that the question of U.S. foreign policy in Africa has been broached, because it's not just the immediate issue that we're discussing, which is the question of vaccines and to what extent they will be distributed widely in Africa. It's also the malign and malignant policies that U.S. imperialism has pursued historically on the continent that has weakened these countries, making them more susceptible to being ravaged by various maladies such as the coronavirus. It's not just the question of structural adjustment as pursued by the International Monetary Fund, which for so many years forced the public sector in Africa, particularly the health sector, to be downsized, but it's also the covert and overt foreign policies For example, Mozambique, a neighbor of South Africa, came to independence in the mid-1970s under the Frelimo government that was trying to pursue a policy of socialist orientation and non-alignment. But alas, in the mid-1980s, the founding father of Frelimo and modern Mozambique, Samora Machel, was killed in a very mysterious airplane crash. His plane directed into a mountain in South Africa, and of course, there was likely collaboration between Washington and apartheid Pretoria. And since that time, Mozambique has been softened up, so to speak, and now there is an insurgency of religious zealots in the north of the country. Interestingly enough, there are credible news reports that suggest that U.S. allies amongst the Gulf Arab states are quite involved in supporting these religious zealots who specialize in beheading children. And as a result, you have a kind of humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in northern Mozambique. And that has caused many of the regional neighbors to consider intervening on behalf of the Maputo government. But that probably or could lead to retaliation in Harare, in Windhoek, and in other regional capitals. You see a similar policy unfolding north in what is now Chad. I'm speaking of Idris Deby, the leader, who was killed just a few days ago. Chad has been an essential prop in French neo-colonial policy, helping to fight, it is said, religious zealotry that in some ways France and the United States helped to whip up in the first instance. It reminds me of US imperialism's policies in countries like Libya, where they overthrew the government in 2011, or in Iraq, where Saddam Hussein was toppled 15 odd years ago. And then after toppling the government, you see corporations like Bechtel and Halliburton come in to pick over the carcass. So this is the hydra, multi-headed hydra that we're now confronting with this vaccine, or the failure to distribute vaccines being only one aspect of a disastrous and catastrophic policy.
Very well taken point. It really is something, Rania, to even think about that, just taking the step back, that the so-called war on terror from the United States has unleashed so much around the world.
Yeah, and I think it's just so interesting to juxtapose that the sort of tactics that China uses with its relationships with these countries, and how it gets portrayed in the US media as being something really sinister, and like China is going and building things in Africa, right? Like it's really scary. But then to hear that, position of, well, actually like building things is good. And you can see the difference between what the US does and what China does. It is very different. There's a difference between bombing things and funding people and arming various militia groups and the destruction that causes, versus building a road or building a power plant or building a train track or whatever it is that China is working on when it comes to development, and also doing it without these conditions attached of like, okay, well, if you want us to come build infrastructure, then your economy has to work this way or we won't do it. And we're also going to put you in like decades of debt that you can't get out of. And so it is interesting to see those two things juxtaposed, and then also to see the way that that's played out in this pandemic, where there has been, if you look at, you mentioned the wolf warriors, if you look at the way the US portrays what China's doing and has been portraying it, it's been portrayed as something negative, that China and Russia or Cuba, for example, would be sending doctors around the world. That's portrayed as something really insidious and evil. And whereas and the US actually, in fact, did try to pressure countries from accepting Cuban doctors. I believe they pressured Panama to not accept Cuban doctors during a pandemic when they desperately needed the help. I also just wanted to also add something else sinister that these pharmaceutical companies have been doing, and I'd love to get your all's reaction to this, which goes along with this issue of imperialism. through these pharmaceutical companies. This is just one example. This is from the New York Times, that Pfizer has reportedly not only sought liability protection against all civil claims, even those that could result from the company's own negligence, but has asked governments to put up sovereign assets, including their bank reserves, embassy buildings, and military bases as collateral against lawsuits. Now, as somebody who lives in Lebanon, I can say that this did, in fact, this liability protection did slow down the ability of Lebanon to procure Pfizer vaccines, because there was a debate inside the government of whether or not they wanted to allow Pfizer to have this liability protection. And this has taken place in other developing countries around the world. But I mean, I'd love to get your thoughts of that. Maybe you, Mikaela, first, of just like what this means, this liability protection, and not also forcing these developing governments to put up their sovereign assets as collateral to be able to procure this vaccine.
Honestly, I mean, when I read that headline, it was like, once again, the sheer audacity of the US to be, I mean, in the case of their accusations to China, another example, this is one of the things I'm interested in, is China and Africa. So is that they constantly are accusing China of debt trap diplomacy and accusing them of seizing sovereign assets, which hasn't been the case. And the example they tend to cite in, I think it's I'm blanking, but it's a Sri Lankan port. It actually was decades of issues around funding where they couldn't actually resolve paying back loans, that they ended up having to lease it to China because they needed the help, they needed the funding, that they would have the audacity to, without any fear, just make people do the same thing. The kind of accusations they throw around, yet somehow it's okay when they do it, because they have, you know, the kind of moral higher ground, they have the ideological higher ground, all those different things. So, I mean, honestly, it blows your mind, the sheer audacity, and it makes you really think about how we really have to make this serious front against this, because in developing countries, the sad part of it is we already have for 200, 300 years sold our sovereign assets through the colonial period, right? And the kind of post-independence, flag independence period generally was no better, because you often had to put up collateral in order to get, you know, minimum capital investment so you could re-export all the goods you make back to the global north. So, I mean, it's crazy, and we really do have to find a way to fight back against this.
Dr. Horne.
Well, this obviously is an example of what has been characterized as disaster capitalism. That is to say, seeking to capitalize upon a crisis by profiting even more handsomely. It's also, as has already been suggested, yet another example of why we must point to Washington and say, physician, heal thyself. What I mean is that at the same time that Washington points the finger of accusation at China with regard to all of these accusations concerning debt trap diplomacy and all the rest, you see Washington actually practicing it. And so, as the saying goes, they point a finger at China and have three fingers pointing back at themselves. But I think what we need to realize as well, and this is something that we're really going to have to think about very deeply and carefully, is that the correlation of forces globally may have shifted to the advantage of the People's Republic of China and its allies. And we may have to consider that, for example, when Mr. Biden speaks about a stronger role of the state, turning his back upon the policy of Ronald Wilson Reagan and a good deal of the US ruling class with regard to government being the problem, this may be a forced march, if you like, in response to China's strong state and US imperialism feeling that the only way it may be able to keep up is seeking to emulate the People's Republic of China in its own narrow way, of course. And certainly, if you look at this policy of US imperialism today, which is seeking to, as they put it, repair the frazzled alliances supposedly shattered by the 45th US president, Mr. Trump, it's not going to be easy. If you look at the European Union, for example, which is going to be essential to this alliance strategy of Washington, you see that for years now, the Eastern European members of the EU have been meeting with China on a regular basis in the 16+1 alliance. And then there has even been some talk, believe it or not, that Germany, which has China as its major external trading partner, that is to say, external to the European Union, that there is talk now about Germany, which gets a good deal of its energy from Russia, aligning more closely with Moscow and Beijing in a sort of Berlin, Moscow, Beijing de facto concord, which would obviously upset the apple cart in Washington. And if that happens, you'll see US imperialism become ever more desperate. You already see how they're harassing Chinese vessels in the South China Sea. Although, keep in mind that in recent war games practiced by the Pentagon, which are obviously stacked in favor of Washington prevailing over China, in every war game that they practice, China has prevailed. So this may be a very propitious moment for an offensive by anti-imperialist forces, not only in the United States of America, but I would say globally, if in fact Washington and US imperialism is on the defensive, as it appears to be, and certainly pushing back aggressively with regard to vaccines may be a very useful place to start.
I think that there's so many inflection points coming up, recently that'll show us that in many ways. I myself am looking I think the next German elections are going to be very interesting. I mean, the Green Party now trying to position itself with this pro-US, anti-Russia, anti-China democracy rhetoric. And of course, the CDU, long history of being for closer relations with Russia. So it seems like they're going to try to make that one of the biggest issues in the German elections. It'll also be a big issue in the French elections. I mean, there are just so many different elements of this. The world is changing in such an unbelievable way, for maybe good or ill, but the struggle will determine it. We could talk all night. We literally could talk all night. Y'all are some of the best guests we've ever had on the show. I really appreciate you. Appreciate you coming back, Dr. Horne. But Mika, Dr. Horne, really appreciate you guys joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Awesome. I hope I can be a repeat offender like Dr. Horne.
Yes.
We will absolutely. Now you've actually written your own epitaph. You've asked to come back, and now we'll never leave you alone.
We're going to make you wake up in the middle of the night and do
it.
this again.
Right
awesome.
on. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
All right, bye-bye.
Rania, I mean, it was really, there is so much there, the whole conversation from beginning to end. I don't even know if this is the right time to ask, what some of your, I don't know how you're feeling, what you're thinking. I don't know if they're final thoughts here.
I got not necessarily final thoughts, but I did get a message from a friend who was watching the live stream.
It's like you want to be a millionaire.
That they're from it was a link to a Clubhouse chat. So
they tried to get you to come to Clubhouse during the show?
Well, no, it was the irony is as we were doing this live stream, there was a Clubhouse chat that is the president of Moderna. It's on Clubhouse with Clifton Leaf, editor of Fortune magazine, along with Mursal Khalif, Minister of Health of Somalia's Jubaland, and some other medical professionals. So I just wanted to let our viewers know, in case they wanted to hear capitalism's point of view, that Stephen Hoge, the president of Moderna, is on Clubhouse as we speak with the editor of Fortune magazine.
What was the name of the Fortune editor again?
The Fortune, it was a funny name, Clifton Leaf.
That just sounds like the editor of Fortune magazine, Clifton Leaf.
Sounds like a made-up name.
I just feel like he really is, I don't even know, is at the turn or something in the golf course. I mean, it just Clifton Leaf on so many levels. I appreciate that you're up on Clubhouse, but go ahead.
Yeah. I just want everybody to get, all points of views. I don't think the capitalists get enough airtime or platforms.
Indeed.
I do think, though, that was really, I think, every end of the show, I always think that's the best show we've had. And I think that's a great thing to feel at the end of a show. And I feel like that was such an amazing show. I wish that conversation could have gone on longer. I will say I want to come back to that issue of China versus the US and the perception from the developing world, because I think that one of the threats that China poses that doesn't get talked about is it does offer this ideological this ideological challenge to the US, where it has set up this system that operates outside of like the US's ability to bully it. It's basically China is like a developing country that has developed, and it really ends up being almost like an inspiration in a way for what other developing countries can try to become. And you look at all these countries in the third world that have adopted, whether voluntarily or not, mostly involuntarily, this neoliberal system, and what it's led to is complete rot and decay and a like debt and servitude and lack of basic infrastructure. And then you look at China and you see what was basically a peasant developing country having all that infrastructure and actually using its wealth to try and help other developing countries build that infrastructure as well so they can trade with each other. And so I do think it's a really unique perspective to hear from people who are in those countries and how they perceive China versus America, because it is a very, very different relationship. And it's definitely very different from the way it's portrayed in US media.
No, I think
so
that's so
really
important.
Michaela's point of view. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, Bill Clinton was mentioned briefly by Kambale. And I remember when Most Favored Nation came up for China in the late 90s. And the whole thing was, basically that China is no threat and it only is going to help the United States, and it'll ultimately that they would destroy communism for them to have more trade with the US. So I think when you're looking at it from, the developing world, the global south, so-called third world, whatever we want to call it, it really is. It has to seem so miraculous. It seems miraculous to me that in, just a couple decades, it went from, we're going to destroy communism via trade and everything's going to be fine, to like, whoa, not only is everything not fine, but this is a counterexample to the way we are running the world. And I think if your country's been mired in forced poverty, to see how a country can go from completely divided and on its knees in the pre-revolution era, I mean, they call it the 100 years of humiliation, to now one of the most powerful countries on earth with some of the most innovative policies around a number of things. I mean, I think we don't talk enough about, there's so much negativity. And listen, there are plenty of negative things you could say, just like any country. But it is notable when you look at the way that the lockdown worked in China and why it succeeded. And the same thing can be said about Vietnam, another communist country, was because they didn't just lock the country down. They made sure that people had a way to get food, that people had a way to get medicine. In fact, in the apartments themselves, people were coming together to form different brigades to check on people and to do different things, to send one person out to get everybody's things and all these different pieces to make it work. But it was like a full mobilization. The thing I'll never forget, Rania, and I can't forget it because we were here in New York City, which was just being hit like, it was unbelievable. It really was like a war type situation. And I went on the Global Times, which is, of course, one of the main newspapers there in China. It represents, allegedly, some of the more pro-communist views, hardliners, as they say in the West. And the huge headline, it was like the whole top of the website was like, I'm trying to remember the exact phrasing, but it was like the battle to save Beijing. And I'm not even really 100% sure who the audience was this for. They obviously directly translated the front page from Chinese because it was sort of seemed to be aimed towards a more internal audience. And the whole thing was about no COVID can get into Beijing. We must protect the nation's capital. We must protect the integrity of the country. We have to make sure that we don't have a total collapse here by allowing the centralized government and economic infrastructure to fall down. And it spoke to me so much because we're here in New York City, which has to be the most well-known American city on earth. It's one of the great global icons of one of the great global icons of the world. Everybody knows New York City. It's certainly the economic epicenter of the U.S. economy, and in many ways, the world economy. It's one of the main tourist cities in all of the country, and it was like the government didn't even care. And, Trump and others were just like shrugging their shoulders. And it was such a notable thing to me that they would mobilize the whole country in China around this goal. And that here you have what many would say is the crown jewel of capitalist America, certainly the economic nerve center. And it's like, well, who cares if tens of thousands of people die? Since all our rich friends can just flee to wherever the hell they went, who cares if anyone else dies? And to me, it was such a powerful statement about the two.
Well, I think that it speaks to having a centralized government versus not. And in America, we really don't. Like, we have a bunch of different state governments, and things are just kind of like, you got Ron DeSantis, and you have Andrew Cuomo, right? Like, it's just, I mean, I think that the difference between capitalism versus socialism was very much on display during this pandemic. The difference between having a strong state, like centralized state, and structures that could actually put in place these kinds of strategic lockdowns, right? Because not all of China locked down. It was a strategic lockdown, and it was geared towards where there was outbreaks. And so it is something that should be studied. And I think it speaks so much to the decay and rot in our own system. And, really, I think when we look back on this era 50 years from now, if we're still around, or at least historians will look back on this era, they really will see COVID-19, this pandemic, as having played an acceleratory role in the rise of China and the fall of America. And I'm not saying that's going to happen tomorrow, but I think that we see the decline of America. America's leaders see the decline of America from the inside out, and it's a gradual decline. And this rise of China as an economic powerhouse, not necessarily a military one, but an economic powerhouse that I believe is set to overtake the American economy by like 2028, which makes sense. It's a country of over 1 billion people. It makes sense for them to have a bigger economy. But I think that historians really will look back at COVID-19 as this very important moment that defined the difference between these two countries on the stage in a way like never before, and in a very negative way for America.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good note to end on from my point. Obviously, there's so much that could be said. As always, Rania, it was such a pleasure to be alongside you here.
Same to you, Eugene. It's always a pleasure. I can't wait till next week.
Well, I hope everyone goes to patreon.com/breakthrough news. That's patreon.com/breakthrough news. You can become a patron. We are brought to you by you, and all of your assistance is what allows you to bring great programs like The Freedom Side to you, all the reporting that you're seeing. So patreon.com/breakthrough news. If you're watching on YouTube, and if you're not, you should go to youtube.com/breakthrough news. You should subscribe to the channel, and you should hit that bell so you can get alerts and you won't miss anything from Breakthrough News, the least of which, well, I don't know if it's the least of which. I'll let you judge for yourself, but you won't miss The Freedom Side at 8 p.m. Eastern on Thursday nights with Eugene Puryear and Rania Khalek. We are going to end it here tonight, but we will see you next week.